Hi, hello everybody, and thanks for joining us for this MozFest Dialogues and Debates. Today we're going to be discussing digital censorship. My name is Solana, and I'll be your moderator. I work on Mozilla's Insights team as editor of the Internet Health Report. Today, we're going to have a really important conversation about censorship, and we'll be discussing the impact of digital censorship and its effects on the ground in different parts of the world. Depending on where you are and what you do on the internet, different things may come to mind when you hear the word censorship. Today, we're going to be exploring the intersections between government censorship and what some people call platform censorship, when voices are silenced by big tech in different ways. And I'm happy to introduce you now to a group of digital rights advocates and researchers who will speak with us about what can be done to make sure that voices around the world are not silenced. Today, we have Marianne Diaz Hernandez is here. She is a Keep It On Fellow at Access Now. Marianne is a Venezuelan lawyer, a digital rights activist, fiction writer, and she's currently based in Santiago, Chile. And her work focuses mainly on issues regarding online freedom of speech and privacy, web filtering, infrastructure, and digital security. She's also the founder of a group that's called Acceso Libre. It's a volunteer-based organization that documents threats to human rights in the online environment in Venezuela. We're also joined by Odanga Madung, who is a fellow at the Mozilla Foundation, and he explores the intersection of civic freedoms and technology in Africa. And he's also a journalist with bylines at BuzzFeed News, Wired, Deutsche Welle, Quartz, where he's written a lot about the effects of technology companies on African societies. And finally, Rasha Abdul-Rahim is the director of Amnesty Tech, a globally distributed team of advocates, hackers, researchers, and technologists who work with Amnesty International to ensure that technology benefits human rights. She manages Amnesty Tech's work on digital repression, surveillance, the business models of big tech, privacy and data protection, platform accountability, and advances in AI. So you can tell we're going to have a wide-ranging conversation that will visit many different corners of the world, I expect. I'm really excited to speak with you all and happy that you could be here. And one last thing for anybody who is watching, we're taking questions for this panel in real time. You can tweet them at Mozilla over Twitter or using the hashtag dialogues and debates, all in one word. And there'll be folks watching on Twitter for your questions. So I thought we would start with a little bit of context and warm up to the conversation, namely talking about what does digital censorship mean to you? And Marianne, we could start with you. What does it mean to you and for the work that you do?
Thank you, Solana. I have studied digital censorship for over a decade, as I was telling you earlier. And for me, from the context I'm coming from, which is an authoritarian government and studying authoritarian governments in the region, Latin American region as well, censorship is often a tool used by the government. So we're talking about different techniques of blocking content online, stopping access to content, which also means blocking VPNs and means also prosecuting people who are expressing themselves online, sometimes unplugging the internet entirely or unplugging some parts of the infrastructure that allows connectivity, which means also sometimes power infrastructure and other types of underlying infrastructure that allows connectivity. And that's not, of course, the only form of censorship that exists, but it has been the focus of my work because it's prevalent on places where there are authoritarian governments. And in these places, censorship means of course, first, the inability to express yourself entirely online, be it because you cannot access the means to do so, you cannot access the applications where people are speaking, the places where people are speaking, but also you cannot access the information because when someone else is being blocked to do so, in Venezuela, for instance, there are many digital media platforms that are blocked. Newspapers that moved to digital and now are blocked. And so when people want to access, they're on Twitter, for instance, and they see a headline and they want to read the news and they cannot do so. And without the information, it is very difficult. It becomes an environment where information cannot move freely, and it becomes very difficult to participate and to engage politically and just in general in society. And this brings me to the second portion of this, which is that in that environment, people tend to self-censor because they start feeling the fear that it will bring consequences for them to express themselves, or to ask for information, or to want to access this information that is not allowed to them. And just the fact that you have to start a VPN to access something makes you feel that you are doing something wrong, makes you feel that this is not entirely legal because someone wants to stop you from doing that. And so you start taking care of everything and being very careful about what you say. And as I always bring with me this phrase that someone said to me many years ago, and you start being careful of what you think, because these self-censorships are seeping in up to a level when you stop yourself even from thinking certain things. And it is extremely dangerous, and it's damaging to society as a whole.
Thank you, Marianne. And Rasha, you work with Amnesty International, and I think the type of censorship that Marianne is talking about, where that you have a repressive government, you have self-censorship, where people are, as they call it, but you're also looking at business models of big tech, and how has censorship evolved as a concept for an organization like Amnesty or in your work? How does it become about what platforms are doing as well?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for having me on this panel. And in addition to what Marianne has spoken about, there is indeed a corporate angle to this when we're looking at big tech companies like Facebook and Google, who are dominant, right? They have combined over 2.5 billion users. And so they sort of set the terms for access to the online world. And they have policies which govern what can and can't be said online. They take down content that is not consistent with their policies in terms of service. But in addition to their policies, there are also automated systems that monitor what people can say and monitor content, and they flag content for removal, or they remove content in an automated way. And so when we're looking at an ecosystem that is dominated by two big tech companies, a handful of Silicon Valley tech companies, this is a question of power. This is a question of dominance and setting the terms for accessing the online world, and also for what can and can't be said. And often the problem there is that the whole business model is sort of set up to amplify certain types of content. Abusive content, disinformation, incendiary content, to keep people online for as long as possible, to keep their attention for as long as possible, in order to gather ever more data, very intimate personal data on them, which then creates profiles on those people, and those profiles are sold to whoever wants to influence people, which includes, of course, advertisers, but it could also include political actors or others that want to influence people and people's thinking and people's behavior. And that became very clear in the Cambridge Analytica scandal a few years ago. But it's also an ever present threat that affects us all. And so when you have that, and that combined with so business models sort of incentivizing certain content to sort of proliferate online, when you have that in addition to untransparent, unaccountable algorithms, which are also making decisions on what can and can't stay online, you have a very powerful recipe for abuse. And certainly we've seen in various contexts around the world, people's content being taken down without transparency, without enough information to justify, and without, in some senses, a clear and transparent policy so that people know what kind of content will stay online and won't. So I think in addition to government censorship, we're seeing this huge power of corporate censorship. And we're seeing companies like Facebook and Google, but also others that are emerging, TikTok, sort of acquiring quasi-state power without the same level of accountability that is often bestowed on governments.
Thank you, Rasha. Odanga, you've been an observer of big tech platforms all throughout the Africa region, and I wonder what comes to mind when you hear about power and perhaps abuse of power in the context of digital censorship?
Thanks a lot, Solana. Well, when it comes to censorship, digital censorship, in my region of the world, I like to think about it from two perspectives, and both of them come from the first principle definition of what censorship is, which is what are the powers that be trying to keep us from doing, right? What are they trying to keep us from accessing? So on one front, you've got, the absolute brute force method, which is what we've seen in countries such as Nigeria, in countries like Uganda, and currently what's happening in Eswatini, which is formerly Swaziland, which is internet shutdowns, right? Where governments just go ahead and absolutely block all forms of access to the internet in attempts to block dissidents from expressing themselves and from coalescing and gathering together. That's number one. And then in the second part, I think it's the aspect of removal of content by platforms. And this could either be, again, due to government influence, such as what the Nigerian government is trying to push Twitter to do by forcing them to register locally within Nigeria, or the second one, which is as a result of their own platforms and policies, which again often tends to lend itself towards more government-oriented requests. And so those are the two areas where we have seen quite a bit of friction with regard to censorship going on within the African continent, and specifically even within my own regions, which is East Africa as well.
Thank you. And just in these recent weeks, there's been a lot of debate, news headlines internationally about platforms in the context of the COVID pandemic, not removing enough misinformation. There's a lot of attention paid to the things that platforms are not taking offline. And I wonder, how would you describe how this issue of keeping things online connects to those concerns? Marianne?
Oh, I have a lot of opinions about this. Like over the years, we have been, like, the civil society has been having an ongoing conversation with social media platforms, and over and over about where the line is or should be regarding to what content should be kept and what content should go. This is, as we all know, is something that varies widely from culture to culture, and there is also an ongoing discussion of it should vary widely from culture to culture, from country to country. But the thing is that, and this is something I have told the platforms, and they haven't liked it, they said, that we keep talking to them in terms of human rights. Like, we think that freedom of speech should be the bar, we should set the bar at freedom of speech. And then that means that content about hate speech, for instance, is out, and content that is protected by freedom of speech should be protected. But platforms do not work like that. And working under the assumption that they do is a mistake by us. They work in terms of what works for the platform and for the economic model of the platform. And that means that what works for Twitter or for Facebook is entirely different from what works for 4chan or for Reddit. And that means that there is a level of homeostasis, that they are looking that content that is uncomfortable in that in that community, let's say, will be removed for being uncomfortable, not for being not protected. I have, again, been having this conversation particularly with Facebook over and over, that if I say here in Latin America that I wish my president is Nicolás Maduro, would die, that is removed, that is not allowed, that's considered to be hate speech. But that is not hate speech under international terms or national terms, because I am not attempting to do anything. I am not asking for people to kill him. It's just, I'm just expressing a desire of my heart. But this is not allowed. And on the other hand, I have been told all sorts of things on these platforms. I will not bring examples today, but I have been denouncing things that are said to me that Facebook says are not hate speech. And this bar keeps moving, and it's moving just because of how many people it will annoy this content. And again, I do think that human rights should be the bar, that we should set a parameter that responds to human rights. But thinking that just because what platforms do sometimes overlaps with human rights standards, that means that they are using this as some sort of guide is a mistake. They are doing what works for the business model. And while the business model it remains the same, it will never respond to human rights standards as we wish.
And so clearly we're talking about nuances here, where sometimes it's about keeping things online and sometimes it's about removing things that don't deserve to be online or that are harmful when they remain online. We at Mozilla, at one point, I helped put together a report called When Content Moderation Hurts, where we gathered stories of where content moderation was too excessive, where, crossed the line for what people felt was reasonable. Rasha, I wonder if you could share some specifics of any examples you can think of where that line was crossed, where it felt like digital censorship and not just a rounding error or a mistake or an individual content moderator that made a mistake.
Sure. So I think one very pertinent and recent example is in relation to the protests in Palestine back in May, and of course the Israeli offensive on Gaza, where there appeared to be a trend developing of content takedowns, excessive content takedowns, and in many cases unjustified content takedowns of Palestinian content. This was seen primarily on Facebook and Instagram, but there were also some instances on Twitter. And what we were seeing was content being flagged as sensitive or as offensive when it was just, for example, people sharing accounts that are recommended that people should follow. It was accounts being temporarily suspended of very prominent people, very prominent figures like Marianne, who's a prominent Palestinian journalist, but also of content posted by activists on the ground who were filming excessive use of force by the forces, by the Israeli Defense Forces. For example, Hamle, which is a Palestinian digital rights organization, reported in the month of May 500 incidents of content that was taken down, and they received reports that this was done in an unjustified way. And so, Instagram posted a sort of a statement saying that they had a glitch, and that was the cause of these content takedowns, that they were very sorry and that they were working on it, which it may well have been a glitch, but that doesn't sort of devolve them from responsibility, because the fact is people's content was taken down and people weren't able to connect with each other, and people essentially were censored. And even after Instagram had made that statement, people were still experiencing, we received reports that people were still experiencing the content taken down, or that their accounts had been temporarily suspended. Now, the impact on this is enormous. Social media has enormous power and benefits to people whose voices are not often heard, and particularly in this context where there is a prevailing narrative and a dominant narrative that does not center the voices of Palestinian people and Palestinian activists on the ground. And so, it's important to just contextualize a little bit what was happening, which was that the protest started in relation to forced expulsion of Palestinians from their homes, and then that kind of developed into a wider sort of solidarity movement across the West Bank and also in Green Line, Israel. And then that also developed into further protests against the offensive that was launched on Gaza. And so it was termed the Intifada of unity. And so social media was a really important way for people across the country to connect with each other, to be in solidarity with each other, but also in the context of the offensive and in the context of excessive use of force. It was a very important tool to document human rights violations and in some instances war crimes that were occurring. And let's not forget that there is an ongoing investigation by the International Criminal Court at the moment. And so this documentation is extremely important for future accountability. And so once you contextualize this and you think about the sort of solidarity, the documentation, centering Palestinian voices, cutting through the mainstream media, cutting through the dominant narrative, having content censored in this way, having accounts taken down in this way, even temporarily, has a huge impact on people on the ground. And so, frankly, it's not good enough to say, sorry, this was a glitch. I often find that the response of big tech companies, social media platforms is very sort of too little, too late. It was completely foreseeable that this was going to happen. And there should have been proactive steps taken to prevent this from happening, to prevent the sort of disproportionate content takedowns, and in some cases erroneous content takedowns. One example is again Al-Aqsa, the post about Al-Aqsa Mosque being taken down erroneously because of the sort of it being linked to terrorist organization. And again, that was another mistake that Instagram sort of owned up to. But this goes back to two issues, I think. One is to do with policies and certain content being flagged as threatening or offensive or in support of terrorist organizations. And there are some of these policies that exist. There's a policy on Zionism, there's a Shaheed policy, and those need to be looked at, and those need to be contextualized, and there needs to be meaningful consultation with people on the ground, Palestinian groups on some of these policies. But then the second issue is also to do with what I was mentioning before, which is algorithmic systems which are used to take down content, and the lack of transparency around how those algorithmic systems work, the lack of independent auditing of those systems, which we've been calling for, and several groups have been calling for. And I think that as a combination has created a really sort of dangerous trend in excessive content takedowns of Palestinian content, which we saw very, very recently.
Thanks for walking us through those examples, and also for explaining how much is at stake. And you mentioned a very specific example and a conflict. Marianne was talking about the situation, political turmoil in Venezuela and repression. And I think a lot of the cases where we see either shutdowns or censorship or disagreement on this issue are in these heated moments for countries that you see conflict, you see elections, you see pandemic is obviously a big one. Odanga, I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about what you've observed in terms of the governments and the corporations coming together to make censorship soup, to see where do these issues intersect, and perhaps you could talk about an example where it was less about keeping something online than the need to take something offline.
Okay, so I think we're definitely at an interesting point for those of us who've been observing content moderation. I think we're definitely at an interesting point in the history of this, novel sector, if I could call it, because if you think about it, a few years ago, a lot of us were complaining that a lot of these big tech companies were not taking enough content down, right? That there was too much problematic content that was staying up. And now we're seeing that, the attention is being turned to the opposite side, where we're seeing that they're cracking down a bit too much, especially on minorities across the world. And that is definitely something that is worth looking at. Now, in terms of the government and big tech soup, I do know that it is because of these efforts to sort of cook a soup between government and big tech that we are seeing a lot of these platforms getting banned, right? That is one of the reasons Facebook, until this point, actually, I completely forgot that Facebook is actually still banned in Uganda, right? Simply because some of these platforms will not have refused to abide by the rules of the governments that are in place. Same thing goes for Twitter in Nigeria, right? But what is interesting, and I think what is going to be worth observing, is what happens when these platforms go ahead and actually end up abiding by the rules in order to stay in the countries. And case in point being India, because in India, Twitter actually has decided to abide by the rules that the Indian government has placed for them by offering, by setting up, of course, having the local office, and then, of course, hiring what they call a local grievance officer in order to respond to government requests. So watching what happens, especially in that market, is going to be very interesting going forward. Within the African context, I'm yet to see a case whereby, we're seeing, very explicitly governments and big tech getting together and, as a result of those kind of requests, leading to a sort of pull down of massive pull down of content. The few cases where I have seen this kind of cracking down on dissidents by platforms was, I think, perhaps in the case of Nigeria and the NSAS movement, where we did see Facebook censoring a large number of people who are posting pieces of content to do with the protests that were going on with regard to the NSAS movement in Nigeria. And just as the other panelists had mentioned, they chalked it up to it being a mistake, right? And when we look at the kind of mistakes that these platforms make whenever they're moderating content, they do tend to have very big consequences. And so there is definitely need to relook at the kind of policies, and rather provide some form of transparency as to how exactly these platforms are moderating this content, because AI alone is not going to be enough. And even the reasons and justifications that they give that the AI itself is actually improving as time goes, I think the more and more they make these kind of mistakes, the more and more they show that there's actually nothing that is really going on. So that's it for me.
Thank you. And in case anybody missed that, that was part of, thinking about Twitter, the entire platform of Twitter banned in Nigeria, if you haven't heard about that before, entire platform of Facebook banned in Uganda. These kinds of things happen often around the world ahead of contentious elections, because of disagreements. And Marianne, you were talking earlier about self-censorship of individuals. When you yourself censor what you're thinking or what you're doing, or sort of restrict your own speech because of concerns of what might happen. And there's a parallel there, I think, with what some of you have spoken about, where the platforms also self-censor in a way. So before they're asked even by the governments to take something down, or before they're criticized by a political faction or a user demographic, they might go ahead and remove things before it becomes necessary, just to be overly cautious, or set their AI moderation tools to be overly restrictive in order not to get in hot water, because it is difficult for them, isn't it? It's hard to do this on a global scale across so many different languages. And so I wonder, what do you think can be done? What are the things that you're feeling most passionate about when it comes to proposing strategies to stop voices from being silenced online?
Yes, this is something that's happening a lot in the region, both for social media platforms, but also for internet service providers. We have laws and law initiatives that tend to be intentionally broad or intentionally vague, and that space of vagueness is the space where over censorship happens. It's the space where the platform, the company, the provider, whoever, will say, okay, we'd rather err in the side of over censoring than facing a fine or facing losing our permission to work here. There was a proposal in Mexico, just to not keep talking about Venezuela over and over. There was a recent proposal in Mexico where they wanted companies to register in Mexico to be able to operate in the country. And again, it was very vague in terms of consequences. And that's the kind of thing that platforms say, okay, it's either pulling out of this country or of this region, which is not good for the platform, but also it's not good for the people there, because they are not going to be able to use it at all. So it's it may work at some political level, but may. And so I think that for us, whenever possible, when we have countries that allow for this kind of interaction, the first and the most important thing is to make sure that our laws are extremely precise. When we addressed any sort of possibility of removing speech, of censoring speech, of restricting speech, there are places where that's the case, where that's what should happen, but that's an exception. And as an exception, it should be extremely well defined in the law, because that space of leeway that you give either the government, the companies, or whoever that's put in place of restricting speech, that's the place where human rights violations will happen. And so you need strict laws and you need judicial control, a place where you can go to that will make sure that those measurements are strict. And that's also the case, again, in Latin America, that restrictions of speech are put in place by administrative bodies, which is against the international regulations and against the inter-American standards. These restrictions should only happen when a court says so and or after a due process. And we love giving that power to administrative bodies, and that makes it extremely faster. It's something that is just doesn't respond to due process, that sometimes doesn't respond to any process at all. And of course, it puts the companies that operate in that country in a very precarious position, because they have to do basically what the courts are not doing. They have to respond to a government that's pushing back against them, and it's not their place to do so. There shouldn't be burden with that. That should be on the courts. But then again, that requires some level of democracy working in order for us to do that. So I think that the third thing I would say that then is that we should have some sort of standards that work internationally, so that we as a broader community can push back against those kinds of governments.
Mm-hmm. So there's a policy response, there's an accountability need to be able to hold the companies accountable, for governments to provide clarity on what is allowed, what is expected. Rasha, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the difficulty unraveling what actually happens in these situations that are contentious. You mentioned the case of the Palestinians who were silenced online. There are many other examples, I think, where people complain and there are a lot of rumors about what happened, and then the platform will say something, but there isn't a lot of clarity while these things are happening, but there also isn't a lot of clarity afterwards. There isn't like, what kind of transparency do we need, or do you feel is most urgent to change this issue at a systemic level to make things less bad? I think we can't expect perfection probably with the entire of humanity connected to these platforms, but what are the things that you're asking for most urgently around transparency that would lead to accountability?
Yeah, great question. So I think it's just important to caveat this response with transparency is not enough. Transparency is the first step. There are many other things that should be done, that need to be done, which I'll go into very shortly. But just going back to the context of the Palestinian protests and what we meant when we were calling for transparency, I think transparency around reasons and decision-making processes behind takedowns of accounts and posts would have been really useful, and still will be useful, because yes, there are policies, but they are not clear in all cases, and particularly in the Palestinian context. People who had their content taken down were not clear on why. They were given like a vague reason that violated, I don't know, the hate speech policy, or it violated that policy, but it wasn't immediately evident how it did violate those policies. So I think more transparency around decision making and of content takedowns would be really, really helpful. Ensuring that content moderation policies and community standards are grounded in international human rights law, that they protect freedom of expression, and that let's not also forget that the companies also have responsibilities, human rights responsibilities, and they must ensure that their platforms and their products don't contribute to human rights violations, and they need to carry out human rights due diligence to ensure that they're not contributing to human rights abuses. I think it's also important to convey any sort of clear and detailed reasons in relation to restrictions to specific content as well, and to give people the ability to appeal those decisions, and to have their voices heard when it does seem like mistakes were made. And we know that mistakes are made, as we've seen in our various country contexts. In terms of government requests for content takedowns, companies should absolutely commit to resist government or court orders for content or account takedowns, which are inconsistent with human rights law, and particularly international standards of freedom of expression. And the other transparency that we need is in relation to automated content moderation systems and how they work and how they flag particular content, how they take down particular content. We called for an independent audit of these content moderation systems to understand how they work and to ensure that they are not biased towards a specific group of people or a specific type of content. And then importantly, I think it's also, and this goes beyond transparency, but I think it's also important for companies and governments, of course, to remediate any human rights violations that have come about through these types of restrictions to freedom of speech. And just very finally, I would say that this is not just a content moderation problem. This is not just a content moderation policies or terms and conditions problem. This is a systemic issue to do with the business model of these platforms. And until the systemic issue around the business model is addressed, we'll continue to see these kinds of problems pop up, right? It's the business model. The business model privileges certain content. The business model is designed to keep people on the platforms for as long as possible, to collect as much data as possible. And so we really do need to get to that root cause issue and deal with the surveillance-based business model and to stop the kind of invasive targeting and invasive data collection that we're seeing at the moment. And until that's dealt with, we're unfortunately going to continue to see these problems.
Thank you, Rasha. That's a very compelling summary of so many of the things that need to happen. And it's an issue that we're increasingly concerned and focused on at Mozilla as well, looking at the transparency of algorithms and AI, not just for content moderation, but also for recommendation systems, figuring out how we can get smarter about what gets amplified as well as what gets silenced, and enabling more people to take part in discussing what needs to be done to make sure that important things remain online. Odanga, you've been trying to research, and I say trying to research because it's been difficult, content moderation in different parts of the Africa region, and have been researching more broadly, globally, content moderation across different languages, different cultures. Could you tell me or us a little bit about the difficulty you've encountered researching this topic and what you wish you knew about content moderators and moderation systems? Okay,
well, thanks a lot for that question, Solana. I appreciate it. It has been an interesting journey trying to research what content moderation looks like within the African continent. So for context, as at the last time I had managed to reach Facebook for comment with regards to what their current moderation practices are within the African continent. They said that they currently had, I think, 2 offices within, or rather they said that they currently had 2 offices within the African continent to serve sort of the entire population, that is the entire Facebook population within the continent. Right. And this was being done by, what I have managed to find out is that this was being done by a subcontractor. Now, the hardest part about, I think, researching content moderators is that many of them are currently put under very strict NDAs that sort of keep them from actually talking about what work they do, and many of them are housed in in warehouses which are under very tight security, which very few people have access to. So it has been quite the difficult challenge with regard to trying to find out, okay, what exactly are their activities like? What do they do? What are the effects of the kind of work that they're doing on them? Because as we do know that content moderation is very much backbreaking work. It's very hard work to do. And so gaining access to, trying to understand what content moderators actually go through, what kind of work do they actually do, has actually been a very tough task. And also, I think one other aspect of why I think it's really hard is that it's a very exploitative form of work. Because when you consider the average salary for what a Facebook employee is versus how much Facebook actually ends up paying a lot of these people, very many people do not have the incentive to talk to anyone because it's very much a direct threat to their jobs. And so when you look at it that way, you begin to understand that the kind of companies that are subcontracted to do content moderation, especially in Africa, tend to tout themselves as these companies that have come to save Africans from poverty. They tout themselves a lot on their stories about, hiring people who live in slums and, giving them a means to make a living, which is true. But in many ways, it is very exploitative and deliberately targets poor people to come and do content moderation. And so that whole compound interest of incentives actually is what makes it very hard to research content moderation in our context. What did I wish I knew about content moderation? I think I'd love to know about if there are any measures, taken towards deliberately trying to keep these people that are doing this work safe. I really worry more about the people doing it than even the practice itself, because these people do see very traumatizing things. And, from the things I've read from other countries, in terms of what their moderation crews are going through, in terms of just even getting PTSD, knowing the kind of lack of enforcement in terms of worker safety regulations that happen here in this corner of the world, I do worry about the people that go through, content moderation, because then that means that we've got, a certain number of people in our society that are going through very serious mental health problem inducing work and are not getting the necessary treatment and assistance that they need. And most of all, they're also probably not getting the necessary pay that they need, right? So that is actually a very dangerous precedent to set. And, in many ways, it's not even sustainable, right? So from one of the few things that I've heard about these offices that do the content moderation is that they do have a very high turnover. And it's not necessarily because, the people go on to find better opportunities. No, it's because these people simply cannot keep up with the kind of work that is being thrown at them. So, at the end of the day, there will be a massive reckoning about this industry. And it won't necessarily just be here. I think it will be world over. Something definitely needs to be done about even just how we do the content moderation and the people behind them, because I do believe that it's because of them that we're able to use these platforms, right? They're the ones that keep these platforms usable. Without them, these platforms would be impossible to use, and they would actually be completely unsustainable. So we do need to think about what they go through as well.
I like the sound of a massive reckoning. And I think the reason that it's important to pull in this topic of both content moderation and the secrecy around it is that we're asking often companies who are extremely secretive and untransparent to help protect free speech and open expression. And there is a very big, I think, conflict of interest there, whether you think about it in terms of the business model or the business interests that they need to protect, or what you're discussing here is there are also some really serious labor and human rights conditions within the walls of the companies themselves or the contractors that they hire. So there's also an interest in keeping some of these things secret that we maybe don't as often talk about when we discuss these issues. The problem of trying to think about how to get this right is, of course, that it is so complicated and needs action on so many different levels. We're talking about governments, we're talking about democracy, freedom of expression, open technology standards. There's so much here. Rasha, I would give you what may be the final word. I wonder if hearing what Odanga was explaining and in our conversation here, if there are any parting thoughts you would like to leave for our audience. We might actually be able to do all three of us.
Thank you. I think the parting thoughts that I would give is that are that content moderation is not easy. I don't think anyone is pretending that there are hard and fast rules, that it's that it's straightforward, that we all have the answers. There are it is complex, balancing right to freedom of expression with also the need to take down harmful and abusive content. And of course, what Odanga was talking about in terms of content moderators and the toll that this kind of work also takes on human content moderators. I think we can't ignore that. But I think we can all agree that big social media platforms certainly have the resources and they have the expertise. Not all of the expertise, of course, because we've often called for meaningful consultation with the human rights organizations and other civil society organizations, and that should continue in the development and enforcement of those policies. But I would urge social media companies to take a more proactive approach. As I said before, what we saw in the Palestine protests, I think that was completely foreseeable, and I think that they could have taken proactive steps to mitigate some of the harms that we saw transpire through the use of their platforms. And often it is too little, too late. But they certainly have the resources to do more forward planning to sort of prevent these things from occurring. And just a very, very final thought is that we need to tackle the business model, I think. I've kind of said this, too much before, but I just to kind of repeat, I think that if we are going to have a sustainable solution to some of these issues that we're seeing in terms of content moderation, but also, the spread of disinformation, the spread of abusive content, the spread of hateful speech, incendiary content, getting into, these YouTube rabbit holes, etc. That's not going to be solved just through content moderation policies and enforcement of those policies and, more transparent algorithmic systems. We need to tackle the underlying business model if we're going to have a sustainable solution. Thank you.
Marianne. Thank you, Rasha. Marianne?
Yes, I don't know if I'm going to deviate a bit or just go back to digital censorship. I agree with everything Rasha said. But I'm thinking that there's like another layer to all of this, which is people who are being censored, be it by platforms or by government, are not able to engage fully in any of these conversations that we are having, and we cannot afford to get to any solutions without them. So like the point I want to make is that we need to protect the safety and the openness of the internet. And this means having available, affordable, workable ways for people to communicate privately when they cannot communicate publicly, because they need to be participating in this conversation. That means protecting encryption, for instance, which is under attack constantly. just the right to encrypt communications, just the right to anonymity. Those are things that we need to keep constantly in our minds, because for people who are living under the circumstances of constant attack and constant censorship, we as a society cannot afford to lose their voices. And if they cannot be publicly out communicating, they need to be able to have spaces, safe spaces for them to engage in this conversation. Otherwise, we are not going to get to any of the solutions that we're talking about.
Thank you, Marianne. Odanga, would you like a short comment?
Yes, absolutely. I think from my perspective, the best thing we can do is, I think over the course of my work, I've come to learn that, the internet is not an institution. It is an enabler of institutions. And so in order for us to defend a free and open internet, we then have to invest in institution building, right? When countries shut down the internet and keep people from being able to communicate with each other and to be able to express themselves, the international community lets governments and those leaders get away with it. Why? Because we've let them get away with genocides before. We've let them get away with assassinations before. We've let them plunder funds before. And this therefore points towards a weakness in the general wider state of how we govern our countries and how we govern international relations that needs to be fixed even before we get towards, trying to protect ourselves against these kinds of digital censorship. So this is not something that is happening in a vacuum. And it's something for which we cannot address directly without addressing the other issues that enable it to happen. And so for me, how we protect and allow an open internet and a safer internet to thrive is by institution building and investing in institutions. It will address a lot of the things that we're seeing, even with regard to things like the violation of labor rights for people like content moderators. We need to invest in institutions, and that is probably one of the hard roads out of this. Oops.
Thanks very much. Yes, let there be no doubt that so much is at stake with these issues. It's not just about getting the platforms to behave better so that they're better corporate players. It's because it relates to our political struggles, our human struggles, and our happiness and our health all around the world. It's really important that we keep having conversations like this, that we research the platforms, that we push them to be more transparent, that we push back when they're not behaving well. And I can only end this conversation with another irony, which is to keep an eye on our social media handle on Twitter and on Instagram at Mozilla, where we talk about dialogues and debates and panels and all the important work that we're doing across these many topics. You can also keep an eye on foundation.mozilla.org. Special thanks to Zaina Abiasi, Kevin Sawaki, Audrey Hingle, Mark Walsh, Andy Cockendorfer, and our fantastic panelists and everyone else who contributed behind the scenes. Thank you so much. Thanks for watching. Take care.